Hi, Mike. Nice
Hello.
to see you again. Mike, I remember reading, and obviously when I worked with you, I remember seeing you working on this. And you've got a section in your book, Different Every Night, which is about what I think you call world or worlds. And this talk, I think I'd like to focus on that and, basically ask you what on earth do you mean by that?
Okay. Well, I dislike the word style because it always suggests something stuck on top, a sort of superficial gloss on something. Yeah. And what I'm talking about is trying to discover what is the particular reality of the play or the material we're working on. And when I talk about the reality, um, I don't mean our actuality, how we're living now. You know, we're on Zoom talking to each other. That's our actuality, okay? Uh, but every piece of artwork is some sort of shift away from our actuality. Nothing is totally 100% like life. Even the most naturalistic play or television, where everybody seems to be so lifelike, it isn't, because the material is organized, um, to take us somewhere. And in real life, we waste time. Interruptions occur which would have no meaning in a play. And we're always shifting a little bit away from reality, from our reality, our actuality. And so even a realistic play has a world, has a style, shall we say. And so what happens when you get to plays where characters are cartoons, or they're in Greek tragedies, or or they talk in iambic pentameters and rhymed couplets, and have speeches which go on for sort of 14 or 16 lines, because that is not the way we think or talk anymore. And yet, if I go to see a Shakespeare play, I want to believe the characters and I want to believe them. So they have to be truthful, but not realistic. And I make a distinction between those two worlds because um, real is the sort of reality we're in at this moment. If if I get high on something or get drunk, what sort of reality am I in? And so forth and so on. You see, and for me, this is the most exciting director sort of creative area of the work. So that every production I do creates a totally different world. Ideally, that the audience have never quite seen before. There are no formulas for this. Every play and every production is unique. uh, there are sort of general indications like expressionism, impressionism, naturalism, realism, uh, classicism, romanticism, which are general guides to a whole school of work during a particular period. You know, you know, late 18th century, early 19th century romantic, and it was used after the fact. People saw a common denominator between all these sort of different artists and musicians and labeled it. And it might be a sort of generalized pointer in that direction, but you've got to be terribly specific. All right, so let me give you another analogy. Um, are we playing football or are we playing golf? You know, are we playing table tennis or bridge? Okay, so if we're playing soccer, the rules and the techniques we use are different from those for playing bridge. And the whole rehearsal process is trying to discover and then create and firm up the particular world which we seem to think is appropriate for the material we have. So that generally is what it's about. Now, there are two basic sort of areas. You can divide worlds up into very uh, two categories. One is, let's say, we talk about realistic, which, people wear clothes and come into rooms and eat food, and look sort of normal and behaving normally. We say, okay, but maybe they live in a different culture and a different time. So what are the rules for those worlds? If I'm a sort of 11th century Japanese living in a court, what are my rules? How do I behave? What are my values? What are my foods? I'm coming and going, wearing clothes, going into spaces, rooms, having relationships. I've got to learn, those rules. But okay, or if I'm doing Chekhov, they're not English or British people now in 2020. There are Russian people at the end of the previous but one century, at the end of the 19th century into the beginning of the 20th century. And they are very different because although we're all human, our cultures will make us think differently about certain things and place different values on our emotional expression. So somebody feeling very sad or sorry for themselves in Russia is likely to behave very differently from a 1950s English person, even more so to an Edwardian English person, because some emotions are seen to be totally permissible and some are seen to be not, depending on your culture. I give the rather crude example of, let's say, the very correct, nice middle class, this is slightly dated, let's say middle of the 20th century, mother whose a child has died and there's the funeral. She will not cry because it will upset everybody else and make because the code says, when you're emotional, you upset other people and you don't display your emotions in public because it's rude. It's also revealing. And, we're English, we don't want to show. And also it's upsetting. And if you go to the Middle East, this is a generalization, the mother might well throw herself on the coffin of her child and weep and howl and tear her clothes because that is how her culture has told her she can express her feelings. Now, it doesn't mean to say that one feels more than the other. They can both feel exactly the same, but how they deal with those feelings are absolutely cultural. So you have to learn the rules of a culture, and then there's a whole series of workshops, exercise, improvisations to move the actors out of their current way of thinking and feeling so that they can actually experience and feel and think like the people in that particular world. Okay, so that's one sort of world, which is really a sort of realistic one. Let's say it's all, absolutely things that happen daily, but in a different culture. Okay. Now, the other one, which is trickier, is how far removed is the world of this play from our actuality? I'll leave it now. Do the characters live in a very heightened sense of a tragic universe? Okay. Are they cartoon characters in a slapstick farce where they, well, I shouldn't say cartoon, but are they people in a farce where they don't think, they just react? Because if they thought, there wouldn't be a farce. They're very reactive very rapidly. And they're mainly very bound by social conventions, and they don't want to be seen to be doing something they shouldn't. And so they're always in a state of alarm and embarrassment. Okay, so you have to train yourself to think and feel like that. So therefore, you cannot create a reasonable character when you're playing farce. They have their own logic. Okay, I mean, these are very simplistic examples. And if you are somebody who speaks in verse or in iambic pentameters or poetically, what is that world like? And one of the ways I think, or probably the first way one should embark on this, is to go with the language, because the language will tell you or lead you into that world. So, okay, so if we're speaking in iambic pentameters, although it's truthful, and I have to believe you talk that way, but if I talk in a somewhat more elaborate, complex, subtle language filled with metaphors and similes, yes, with very long thoughts that have to be sustained over 10, 20 lines, okay, and I'm trying to convey very complex arguments within that. How do I use my body? Somebody who talks like that, how do they use the space? What do they do with their clothes? How do you know? And you build out from that and you start to construct and explore a possible world where the way they move, the way they use the space, the way they relate to each other, the spatial, emotional expressions are all of it, belong to one cohesive world. And that's very tricky. And I very rarely see a production which even deals with this. Often, if I go to see classical productions of period plays, everybody's acting in a world of their own because the director hasn't guided them to find this.
You see quite often in a rehearsal room, you will have seen a load of research has been put up on walls. Is that something that you've ever done? Have you ever sort of, given people kind of references to go and look at this
Yes,
and look at that?
yes, absolutely. And I've brought pictures in. I'm not great one for sticking things up on the wall, but why not? And it has happened in rehearsals. People bring things in. I ask the actors to do research. Yes, it's terribly important because if you're dealing with another period, there will obviously be things that were very clear to the audience of that contemporary audience, which have no meaning for you. So you've got to do a little bit of research to find out what that reference was. Now, the danger with research is if you do too much, you find out too much, and you find a lot of interesting things that you're longing to stick into the production, but they won't enlighten the production at all because they're irrelevant to that particular series of situations. So you judiciously have to find your way to read, and get as much information. It is terribly useful. For example, a very simple thing I discovered, I don't know if it's still a tradition, when people left a house for the last time, they all sat down for a minute. And I discovered that when I was doing the cherry orchard. And there's a place where one of the main actress characters says, I'll just sit down for a minute. And, I've seen productions where she sits down, nobody else does, but everybody sat down and didn't say anything for a minute. And it was a wonderful moment because you then have the chance to look at all those people and see how they were feeling individually about leaving this place forever. So that was a very nice gift of doing research. I mean, these things tend to drop into your lap. And of course, you consult somebody, and you go around and find people who are authorities and you make notes. And actors bring stuff in, and from that you condense it and you select what you can. Yeah.
So one of the other things that you mentioned there is, sometimes being guided by the language. And of course, I never saw Black Dahlia, which if it's James Ellroy, isn't it? I mean, his language is, short sentences.
Yeah. And very sharp.
What sort of world research did you?
Well, I mean, not too much because seeing a lot of American movies of the 1940s and 50s and film noir, and having grown up in America, well, not grown up, but spent my 20s in America, and having read a lot of literature and done a lot of American plays or been to a lot of America, most of that world was new to me, and there was stuff about police procedure that we had to find out about, but the language was wonderful because it actually meant that everything had to be very sharp, very quick. And when I started reading his novels, I'd sit down with a book to read, and suddenly I was sitting up because he demands that you sit up and pay attention because he is moving so wittily and sharp, and you've got to get there with him. And I thought that's what the production's going to be like. But just as a bit of gossip, which I don't think has ever happened to me before, when I was preparing the production, I had a dream. And in this dream, I saw a lot of very large men with derby hats, you know, sort of not derby, regular, just ordinary fedoras, you know, what do we call them? Just with soft brims, you know, big and big double-breasted suits, and they were kicking their way into spaces and kicking everything. They were kicking furniture, they were kicking doors, they were kicking the whole time. And I thought, oh, wouldn't it be fantastic that if I have any furniture on the stage, we could kick it and it would fly across the stage. And that, in fact, is what we achieved. We had a metal floor and furniture that was on metal that would slide. And so an actor would sort of kick or push a table on this side at the end of a scene, and it would whiz over here, and a whole lot of other people with chairs would sit down and start a scene like that. And it was wonderful, you know, so that was very fortuitous. But it was responding not just to the material itself, but to the way it was being told. Sharp and quick and demanding and challenging and confronting and aggressive. And we did a lot of very aggressive physical work in that. You know, doing a lot of contact sports, people pushing and shoving. And I remember one day my movement person divided the cast up into two and put them at opposite sides of the room and said, I want you to just push past each other. And he was trying to get them comfortable to push and shove without hurting each other or feeling inhibited, to shove their way out of things. He even got people to wrestle, women and men, women and women, men and men, just to have the courage to be aggressive with their bodies without hurting each other and get to know what they could do and what they couldn't do. And that came out in the work. We also did, every time I do this, I forget, circuit training, you know, so that we'd set up different exercises to do around the rehearsal room, and they'd run from one to the other. You know, they do a minute on this, a minute on that, you know, a punch bag, and then wrestling or weightlifting or whatever it was. And then we'd do it for, say, 10 minutes. And the next day we did it, you know, everything for 2 minutes and the whole thing and we just built it up. And I have to tell you, at the end of those sessions, eventually, when the actors finished, they were so present, they were so alive, their faces were glowing, their eyes were there. And I used to say, all right, do this scene now. Don't stop for anything. No peas, no water, do it. And it was the best acting I've ever seen. The smoothest, they were so available. There was no inhibition. They were so in their bodies and so alive and they all got excited and said, oh, when we go on tour, we must keep doing this when we perform. Did they? No. Anyway, but, you know, but it was really interesting.
Right.
So again, if you get into your body and commit yourself, and you're not straining it. I worked them hard, but it wasn't ridiculous. Yeah. They were so energized, you know, they were there and present. It was wonderful. Mm-hmm. So anyway, so you do research, and then of course, when you're getting into periods which there's no photographic record, the further back in the past you go, the more you have to make intelligent conjectures about how people behave, and you read and you get a sense of things. And it very much depends if you have a sort of sense of certain cultures. I think I do, not of all, but I know the plays I'm attracted to and the material I'm attracted to that culture and have a feeling about it. And I think my feeling has been pretty accurate, you know. And the actors, and the job is to get the actors absolutely at one with that world. So they all inhabit it together and they are all working at the same level with the same forms of expressiveness and energy and use of space, depending on their characters individually, of course, you know. And that's why I keep actors in rehearsal all the time. So we are all moving forward together. We don't miss anything. So we're all learning together and absorbing together. Mm. Yeah. And that's one of the reasons. And, you know, you can go to theatres like the RSC and everybody's in a different play, you know, because they haven't been coordinated for one reality. You know, it's not all the time, but it's very frequent anyway. But basically, It's trying to find the truthful world that will reveal the material you want to do.
Yeah.
It will make it clear and exciting and special and interesting. Yeah.
Okay.
And
Now, listen, Mike, it's been really interesting hearing a very specific set of exercises that you came up with in response to Black Dahlia. You know, I mean, it wasn't that but having sort of looked at the piece, these seem to be appropriate exercises, and most of them worked. Now, wait, let's just have one more example, and I'd like you to go back to your Dickens, to your Bleak House, right at the beginning of your journey with shared experience. Can you think of how, you know, the Dickens world, what you might have done there?
in the language, you see, first of all, the characters are so idiosyncratic and every character has a way of speaking. So just by committing yourself and finding a way of delivering it, the body and the sort of degree of the very strong comedic, often, you know, character comes across. I mean, the characters are divided a little bit between those characters who are more psychologically rounded, shall we say, and some which are veer towards types. But having said that, every character has to be given a realistic, psychologically justifiable form of behavior. So they are capable of all sorts of feelings. But everything is just a little bit larger and life, a little more expressive, a little more presented, a little more there, because they are so individual. They are so individual, you know. And because I had 6 or 7, or finally 6 actors doing 120 parts, all their characterizations had to be very different. And it was wonderful, together with the Laban, to see how they could change and transform totally. Unbelievably so. It was wonderful. We had long rehearsals, I have to say, you know, and the whole project took a year. You know, it was in those days when you could do such things. So, I mean, I'll give you another little very simple example. Let's say you're doing a period, let's say you're doing 18th century. Okay, there's a lot of bowing and curtsying and doffing of hats and so forth. All right, well, people, you know, if you see this production, the actors sort of do it, they've been taught, but it doesn't mean anything. And it looks very boring. It doesn't look as though it belongs to them. But all the way you bow and the way you curtsied were very sexualized and had a lot of meaning. And so you have to embody those as a way of expressing yourself. So each character individualizes the way they bow, and depending on who they're doing it to and how they curtsy and how they take the hat. So it's part of you, what you do. Yeah. And that starts to take you into the period. Also, even if you're not using them, it's always very good to do the dances of the period. I mean, here's a lovely example. I did 2 plays by a wonderful 18th century French writer called Marivaux, who's hardly known over here. And he's brilliant. I mean, extraordinary. So modern, so sharp about people's psychology. But he's sort of connected, always given that sense of being comic like Sheridan or Restoration. He's nothing like them at all. He does deal with upper class people mainly. So that also tends to put people off, and shouldn't do, because the plays are wonderful. And we did some dances. I think it was the minuet. And I have worked with this wonderful choreographer, you know, Sue Lefton. And all the arm movement was figure 8s, and she was talking about how important the figure 8 was in this period. And it suddenly opened a door for me into the production, because I thought, you know, if I'm moving on a figure 8, I'm not always in contact with you. And because all the characters in the play are slightly devious, they're either deluding each other or deluding themselves. They're very rarely confrontational. So we practiced doing endless figure 8s. And if you can imagine having an actor here, an actor there, and an actor there, all doing figure eights, all moving on figure eights. And he thought that when they talk, so I'm never direct with you, I'm like that to you. And when I turn away from you, I can release what I feel. So it got very complicated. It was also very beautiful and fitted the clothes and the way they had their fans and moved. And it became a very heightened, world, and it was great. And because we were doing it in sort of, with the audio, it was almost 3/4. So also it helped to move in that space. I don't know, because the space was sort of round. So the whole thing became this turning of people constantly moving. And every so often when there was a confrontational scene, it was quite shocking when somebody went, boom, somebody else. So you see, these are little gifts that drop into your sort of hand, but you're looking for. And it made the plays wonderful to do and very special and very particular, and so you presented the world. So, and it takes a long time and you have to do a lot of exercising, which we can talk about when I talk about sort of rehearsal structures.
Excellent. Okay, Mike, I think we'll bring this one to a close.
Okay.
And thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you for watching. And I hope you enjoyed that chat. And if you did, would you press the like button and also the subscribe button? That would be great. And if you wanted to be given alerts to when the next one is happening, just press the bell button. If you want to put any comments or any questions underneath here, underneath the video, please do. And at some point I will re-interview Mike, as it were, and put some of these questions to him. So I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.